Hello, this is Art Gaines, and today I've decided to talk about something called the middle way, which is a concept that Jordan Peterson refers to in the 12 Rules for Life. I first encountered the idea, or something very similar to it, during my time at university, and you'll sometimes find the idea in works of secular humanism and in the writings of Satanists. If you're familiar with Buddhism, you may be familiar with a similar term that has something to do with living a life of moderation. But this is not the idea I'm referring to here. The idea I'm referring to has something to do with taking the middle path that supposedly exists between good and evil. Which is of course nonsense, but I'll try to explain the logic behind it. Basically, what it means is that while you shouldn't choose to be evil, for obvious reasons, it is equally problematic to choose to be good, because you will inevitably end up treating people badly or even atrociously if they don't live up to your standards, or if they have a different conception of right and wrong. A related term to the middle way is beyond good and evil. The idea here is that you can only achieve true goodness by moving beyond conventional ideas about right and wrong. People who advocate for this idea often point to various atrocities or genocides that have occurred throughout history and try to place the blame for these events on people who believed in good and evil. They may say something along the lines that if the people who committed these atrocities had not had such dogmatic views about right and wrong, they wouldn't have felt so compelled to murder each other over differences in opinion. In one of the most extreme examples of this, you can sometimes find people trying to blame the Holocaust on Christianity, not by arguing that the Nazis were Christian, of course, but by arguing that it was the Christian heritage of Germany that accustomed the German people to thinking in terms of black and white morality, or moral absolutism. Allegedly, the Holocaust could have been avoided if the German people had recognized the moral superiority of moral relativism. If they had followed the middle way, if they had transcended beyond good and evil and did not concern themselves with such primitive ideas. According to this way of thinking, believing in good and evil actually makes you evil, because it can make you intolerant of other people merely for something as trivial as being different. And this intolerance, allegedly, leads to unforgivable atrocities. These are very extreme cases, of course, which most people do not have to agonize about on a regular basis, but you can find similar sorts of ideas closer to home, even if most people would not recognize the exact terminology I'm using here. An attitude which I've come across, and I would imagine many of you have as well, is that, yeah, fornication and infidelity are bad, but isn't it almost worse to make a big deal about it? I mean, it makes people feel bad if they know you disapprove of or don't accept their behavior, and you don't want people to feel bad, do you? I mean, if they don't have to, why would you do that? If no one got hurt, why would you make a big deal about it? Making a big deal about it in this context may mean refusing to attend family functions with the offending individual or individuals as long as they continue to engage in their unacceptable behavior or refuse to express repentance and remorse. In this sort of situation, the offending party and their supporters, oftentimes other family members and even, I'm sorry to say, other members of the church, may try to convince you that you're the one who's really at fault, that you're the one tearing the family or the church apart, that everything would be fine, everyone would be getting along A-OK if you weren't making a big deal about it. I'm not going to go into very great detail debunking these ideas, either the extreme cases I mentioned or the ones that hit closer to home, because the debunking has already been done by others elsewhere much more thoroughly than I could. If you want to know where and by whom, drop me a question on Gab, BitChute, or Rumble. If you ask on YouTube, I'll direct you to those other locations. I may not be doing any debunking or deconstructive analysis here, but I will make an assertion. These ideas about tolerance and the middle way are very low IQ, and indicate a completely twisted, very low-resolution perception of reality, which is not worth untangling. Intolerance is not the root cause of all the world's problems. The root cause of all the world's problems would be sin, departing from the light of God. I am tempted to explain why these ideas are low IQ, but I hesitate because that's essentially like trying to explain to an idiot why he's an idiot. Something I'm ashamed to say I've put a lot of thought into over the course of my life, but which I've ultimately come to the conclusion is a waste of time. Pearls before swine, that sort of thing. If I was autistic, I might give it the old college try one more time, but I'm not. Sin has consequences. Ultimately, it leads to death. God cannot tolerate sin in His presence. When it is not properly dealt with, it festers and grows, leading to greater and greater abominations. Ignoring it does not make it go away. Fortunately for us, God is not content to leave us in our sin, but has provided a way for us to escape it. He's provided a way for us to find peace, find fellowship, make amends, and to some extent mitigate or lessen the consequences we face for the sin in our lives, the consequences we face for our fathers' sins, and the consequences we face for the sins of our nation. This method that God provides involves confessing our sin, repenting, believing the promises God made in the Bible, obeying God's commandments, and owning the covenants He laid out in the Scriptures. When it comes to differences of opinion between different groups of people, there is actually a method that has been proven repeatedly throughout history to be very good at preventing violence from breaking out. And that is by having different groups of people live on their own territory and rule themselves. Of course, differences of opinion sometimes arise between friends, neighbors, and brothers, and in these situations, conflict can be avoided by extending to each other the mercy and forbearance that God has extended to us. Reasonable people with similar societal expectations can very easily tolerate each other for the sake of the mutual benefits that community provides. Just so long, of course, as the other guy isn't trying to diddle your children, for instance. What is essentially happening when people advocate for the middle way between good and evil, or when people refuse to acknowledge that sin has to be dealt with, is that they have convinced themselves that they're more righteous than God. They may not be saying this verbatim, but essentially what they're saying is, God might have absolute moral standards, but not me. I'm better than that. I'm smarter than that. I don't make a big deal about things unless, of course, they're really bad. If your conception of what constitutes really bad does not conform to what God considers really bad, your perceptions are wrong. There are limits to what God will tolerate and for how long. If you think you might stand before God one day and say, "Hey man, I knew better than you," you should reconsider that attitude. In my opinion, many of the problems we face today in the Western world derive from people who've convinced themselves that they are more righteous than God. And I'm going to give two, or actually three examples of prominent figures who appear to think this, who appear to think that they're more righteous than God. Jordan Peterson, Neil Gaiman, and Terry Pratchett. Jordan Peterson is notorious for being continuously on the verge of becoming a Christian. Year after year, it appears, yet he continuously refuses to take the plunge. I believe that this is at least partly because he believes in the moral superiority of the middle way, which he refers to in the 12 Rules for Life. He believes that accepting an absolute moral code makes you a bad person. He's fallen for the nonsense that believing in absolute truth makes you capable of holocausts, atrocities, and genocides. If you don't recognize this in Peterson's work, it's because he's very adept at concealing what he actually thinks behind a convoluted wall of gobbledygook crafted in such a way that you can project your own ideas into what he's saying. But if you actually make the effort to parse out what he's saying, it turns out that what he has to say is quite weak, low, and pathetic. He believes it's morally superior to sure have your own ideas about right and wrong, but really don't make a big deal about them. You should just float along complacently through life without judging others, thus sparing other people's feelings and avoiding conflict. This philosophy might make sense in a godless universe where men were naturally good and well-intentioned toward each other, but this is not the case. The heart of man is desperately wicked. The Bible indicates that the wickedness of man is beyond knowing. Evil is real. It's insidious. It festers and grows. It has to be stamped out and physically removed when we find it in our midst. The state, the church, and we ourselves as individuals have a role to play in this process.
Lost it already, have you?
Gave it away.
You what?
I gave it away.
Be funny if we both got it wrong, eh? If I did the good thing and you did the bad one.
No. Wouldn't be funny at all.
Good Omens is a novel, and later a very popular TV show, written collaboratively by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, who, in my opinion, could be described as the high priests of secular humanism, because they've both made very sporting attempts at more or less reconstructing the Christian worldview and defending certain Christian values, just without Christ. The plot of Good Omens involves an angel and a demon who become friends. Neither of them are really committed to the grand agendas of their superiors. Higher-ranking angels and demons, God is strangely absent from the story, and both of them generally rely on their own judgment to determine what's right or wrong. The forces of heaven and hell are committed to battling it out to the bitter end, and when the prophesied Antichrist appears, both sides believe that this heralds the climactic final battle, the apocalypse, with catastrophes and disasters that will all but destroy the human race. Both sides want this to happen. They want the Antichrist to take his rightful place and fulfill his destiny. Ultimately, the angel and the demon, being the more complacent and laid-back fellows that they are, and therefore exhibiting a higher kind of virtue, convince the young Antichrist that he doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't have to choose a side. He can choose, if he wishes, to just be an ordinary person, which of course he does, and the human race, rather than perishing in a fiery apocalypse, goes back to their regular lives. By taking the middle path, disaster is avoided. When it comes to what sort of people it must take to come up with this sort of nonsense, the most charitable presumption I can make is that Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett are simply annoyed at Christians for disapproving of their behavior when they want to break silly old social conventions and engage in the old bump and grind with someone they really shouldn't. The least charitable presumption I can make when people promote this sort of idea is that they are trying to convince society to tolerate the sexual abuse of children, or some other horrendous crime or wickedness they are guilty of. The reality, of course, is that the middle way does not lead to some kind of enlightened equilibrium or peace on earth. The middle way is a slippery slope that leads from one wickedness to another, and ultimately leads to hell on earth. If you can't perceive the damage that sin is causing, look harder. Sober up. Read the Bible if you can. Look for true Christian fellowship. Pray for God's light. Thank you for listening. This is Art Gains. If you appreciated this, please like, subscribe, and pass it along. If you want to continue finding my content, look for me at Gab, Rumble, and BitChute. I hope to have a new short story available for you soon. Thanks again.